ice fishing, I guess. Just regular fishing. So recently a friend gave me an article, an essay by author Wendell Berry titled The Burden of the Gospels. And this essay came out of a speech that the writer was asked to give at a Christian seminary for a seminary celebration. And as he was preparing it, he wanted to share with the audience that he wasn't certain in his faith, that he wasn't confident in his faith. And he felt uncomfortable with the many Christian expressions of certainty that we see out in the world, how many seem to know exactly what it is the Gospels say, and they're also certain that they are being faithful themselves. And so he wanted to talk about not being confident as a Christian and making sure that people knew that that was something different than lack of faith. And he says, "My reading of the Gospels, comforting and clarifying and instructive as they frequently are, deeply moving or as exhilarating as they frequently are, has caused me to understand them also as a burden, sometimes raising the hardest of personal questions, sometimes bewildering, sometimes contradictory, sometimes apparently outrageous in their demands." This is the confession of an unconfident reader. And then he asks a question that relates directly to today's passage. He says, if you had been living in Jesus' time and had heard him teaching, would you have been one of his followers? To be an honest taker of this test, he says, I think you have to try to forget that you have read the Gospels and that Jesus has been a big name for 2,000 years. You have to imagine instead that you are walking past the local courthouse and you come upon a crowd listening to a man named Joe Green, or Green Joe, depending on judgments whispered among the listeners on the fringe. You too stop to listen, and you soon realize that Joe Green is saying something utterly scandalous, utterly unexpectable from the premises of modern society. He is saying, don't resist evil. If someone slaps your right cheek, let him slap your left cheek too. Love your enemies. When people curse you, you must bless them. When people hate you, you must treat them kindly. When people mistreat you, you must pray for them. Well, you know how happily that would be received, he says, not only in the White House and the Capitol, but among your neighbors. And then suppose this Joe Green looks at you over the heads of the crowd, calls you by name, and says, I want to come to dinner at your house. I suppose that you, like me, hope very much that you would say, come ahead. But I suppose that you, like me, had better not be too sure. Now, as I listen to today's passage, I can't help but marvel at the disciples' response. They're fishing in the boat. Jesus calls to them, follow me, and immediately they drop their nets. No hesitation, no moment for thinking it over. They just go. When I see myself in their shoes, I see myself holding on to that net, indecisive, thinking, well, maybe. I suppose that would be good, but what about family? What about my livelihood? What about my retirement account? What about all those things? And I'm sure I would hold on to that net long enough for Jesus to just walk on by. We had a great conversation about this passage at our Bible study on Tuesday. And I asked the question that this passage asks of me, which is, which nets are we called to drop? What are we clinging to that keeps us from following Jesus? Are there things that we're hesitating to leave behind that we can go ahead and let go of? And quickly we started talking about material things, which was fine. Simon and Andrew, James and John leave their livelihood to follow Jesus. They leave everything behind. But I think, for those first disciples, they trust that their basic needs will be met as they follow Jesus. In ancient Israel, there's a culture of taking care of religious teachers and their students as they go on their way. When Jesus sends the disciples out, as we see later in the Gospel of Luke, 2 by 2, he says, take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, not even an extra tunic. And when you come to a house, stay there, and then leave from that house. Teachers and students often live this sort of life in the ancient world, and they were okay. So I don't think people would have thought those first disciples were crazy for leaving everything behind like people would think today. I think in ancient Israel, folks would have just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, that's what some people do. My cousin Lenny did that. He was gone for a few years. He came back just fine. Had sore feet, but other than that, he was good. So maybe the itinerant lifestyle, this nomadic lifestyle without a house going from place to place, wasn't as radical as it would be today, but the message that Jesus was offering was still radical. And there's no doubt that Jesus was calling the disciples out of what was comfortable for them. Jesus was calling them out of their normal world and into a new one. And there's no doubt that Jesus was calling the disciples into a life where they would need to trust God more than they were trusting God at that moment. And the disciples go without fear, without hesitation, immediately. They follow. So I don't think Jesus is calling the members of Plymouth UCC to an itinerant lifestyle. So I'm not going to make that case today. We can rest easy. I don't think that's the point for us. But I do think Jesus will always be calling us out of what's comfortable in our lives. Just when we get comfortable with our world and our life, Jesus will show us something more about what God's love and grace mean. Jesus will show us another example of how this love and grace might be shared with the world. Jesus will call us out of what's comfortable and say, follow me. And our challenge will be to place our trust in God, to place our trust in this way of life, and drop the net. I think the Christian life proceeds in stages, like the levels of a video game, or like how the crossword puzzles and Sudoku puzzles get increasingly harder as the week goes on if you're following them in the paper. And just when we're about comfortable with one level that we're at, or one level of difficulty, Jesus calls us to drop the net and move into the next. When I was 16 years old, our pastor at my home UCC church in Larchwood, Iowa, signed our church up to be volunteers at the banquet. And the banquet was a place in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where anyone could go and get a meal if they wanted to. So if you were homeless, if you just didn't have any food in your cupboards, you could go to the banquet and you could get a hot meal. And the organizers enlisted volunteer help from churches and other organizations in the area, and also made sure that people had food to prepare. And so we were invited to come and prepare the food and serve the meal. And this was new for virtually everyone in our church, I think. And it was certainly new for my family and new for me. And I remember being very uncomfortable as I was at the banquet and helping with serving. This was the first time I had served coffee for a homeless man. This is the first time I'd served juice to children who, if they hadn't been there for that meal, they would have been hungry that night. This is the first time I'd really come face to face with poverty and started thinking about the fact that my parents provide my basic needs very easily, and some in the world and just down the road don't have that luxury. So it was uncomfortable, and I did my best to hide that discomfort inside of me and not let anyone know what I was feeling. And then I saw Pearl. Pearl was a widow in our congregation in her mid to late 70s, I think. Always very well-dressed, always very proper, very ladylike, always smiling, didn't say a whole lot, but very, very nice. She lived in a nice house just down the hill from the church, and she was there at the banquet, serving along with everyone else from the congregation. And Pearl was shaking. She was so uncomfortable that she was visibly shaking. And I thought to myself, oh, Pearl. Now, I don't know exactly what was causing her to be uncomfortable or what was frightening her, but I imagine it was the same sorts of things that I was feeling, but I was able to keep on the inside. Our differences were visible. They were right in our face in that room. Some of us had what we needed, and others didn't. And that was uncomfortable. And I'm sure, it's easy to judge Pearl, and I imagine I did so at 16 years of age. But looking back on this story now, I wonder why she was there in the first place. I marvel at the fact that she was there in the first place. No one forced her to go. Pastor just said we're going to be enlisting or calling for volunteers to serve at the banquet. There will be a sign-up sheet in the back. If you'd like to sign up, go ahead. No one forced her to go, but she signed her name anyway. And she must have known that this was going to be uncomfortable for her, difficult for her, as she was signing her name. But she still did it. No one else in her circle of friends went to the banquet to serve. But Pearl decided to drop her net and go. Later in the essay that I shared at the beginning, Wendell Berry says, in the Sermon on the Mount and in other places, Jesus is asking his followers to see that the way to more abundant life is the way of love. We are to love one another. And this love is to be more comprehensive than our love for family and friends and tribe and nation. We are to love our neighbors, though they may be strangers to us. We are to love our enemies. And this love is to be a practical love. It is to be practiced here and now. Love evidently is not just a feeling, but is indistinguishable from the willingness to help, to be useful to one another. The way of love is indistinguishable from the way of freedom. We don't need much imagination to imagine that to be free of hatred, of the endless and hopeless effort to oppose violence with violence, will be to have life more abundantly. Jesus will call us to drop our nets and follow. And this is really about letting go of our fear, or being willing to follow even though we are afraid. Pearl dropped her net and followed, even though she knew it was going to be difficult. She dropped her net and followed, even though her friends remained in Larchwood fishing as they had been before. I wonder, where does the comfort of our familiar world end and the discomfort of the new world begin? Is it when Jesus calls us to love the stranger? Is it when Jesus calls us to love the enemy? To love those who have hurt us? Is it when Jesus tells us to let go of that impulse for revenge, to hurt those who have hurt us, either with actions or with words? Is it when Jesus calls us to be fishers of people, to be those who aren't ashamed of their religious practice, but who share that this is life-giving and invite others to be a part of it too? Is it when Jesus encourages us to focus less on our possessions and more on our relationships? Jesus will invite us to let go of our nets and step out of what is comfortable for us, and to allow love to teach us new things, and to allow grace to teach us new things. May we have ears to hear, may we have hearts that are filled with courage, and may we have hands that are slippery enough that we may drop our nets. Amen.